welcome to Change Festival for our final discussion of the weekend, Rise Up to Reawaken. Why are we here? What does it mean to be alive together at this moment? And how can we be fully present to all that is being asked and offered to us and of us? Not as a rational human, a faceless consumer, trained to generate wealth and productivity, but as a sensual, complex, feeling being who has a loving role in the rich ecosystem of Earth. In this discussion, we will explore ways we can rise up to reawaken our understanding of our own presence, reawaken our bodies and our senses, reawaken our emotions and feelings that we have been dulled and denied, and reawaken our intrinsic loving instincts. When we step aside from the cascade of news feeds, data and social media, we can learn to follow the patterns of nature, practice nothing more, and deliberating less. Practice noticing more. I don't know how we practice nothing more, but maybe there's a clue for how we rise up to reawaken just there. Practice noticing more and deliberating less. We can begin to rest our nervous systems from the onslaught of modern life and find a way of being in the world that gives us deeper meaning and contentment. How will this greater presence shift our perspective on our lives and on our futures? I'm going to invite us just to take a moment of presence with these words. If you'd like to close your eyes or keep them open, and place your feet onto the ground so that you can really feel that connection to the earth beneath us. Feel connected to the skies above us. And each of our presence here on this planet at this time and the connection to the ways in which we are always weaving together and how we have been woven together in this moment. Those that are here in person at Change Festival, those that are here speaking as part of this discussion, and those that are listening from all over the world or watching this. And as you take a few breaths, feel into what is alive for you around this theme of reawakening. And if your eyes are closed, you can gently open them and take a moment just to look at the other people, beings in this space. As I welcome our panel, my name is Amisha Ghadiali and I'm your host today, the host also of the Future is Beautiful podcast, transitioning to a new name of the Futures.Earth. And I am delighted to welcome these three guests. First, Tamsin Omond. Welcome, Tamsin. Since dropping banners against Heathrow Airport's third runway from the roof of the Houses of Parliament, Tamsin Omond has consistently shifted public conversation on the climate and ecological emergency. They have organised and been arrested for a number of high-profile protests, co-founded a suffragette-inspired environmental group called Climate Rush, coordinated the successful Save England's Forest Coalition. It's important to mention successful in campaigns, I feel.
From time to time.
Sometimes it works. Founded a CIC, the Momentum project that mobilises the community surrounding London City Airport, led global corporate campaigns as head of global campaigns at Lush Cosmetics, and been a founding member of Extinction Rebellion. In 2021, Tamsin stood for co-leadership of the Green Party of England and Wales. They are also active in Queer Uprising. They are a theatre maker and author of Rush, The Making of a Climate Activist, and Do Earth, Healing Strategies for Humankind. And I have just invited Tamsin to ride naked through London on a horse in 2022. So
that's my next activist goal.
Let's
see if Amisha gets her wish.
In a nod to Lady Godiva, as we are here in Coventry at the Warwick Arts Centre for Change Festival. And next, I'm welcoming Zoe Palmer. Welcome, Zoe. Zoe is a co-creative artist and human ecologist who works at the intersection of the arts, health, and climate justice. Recent projects include Season for Change Commission, the Dreaming Field Lab, a retreat for Black women and femmes to rest, root, and revision their relationship to nature and the British rural landscape. Her award-winning work in opera has toured across the UK and internationally. Credits as a presenter include the transatlantic slave trade on Discovery, climate change series Fierce Earth on CBBC, Planet of the Apes on Discovery, and Treks in a Wild World on National Geographic. Zoe has worked with bees for over 10 years and sees nature as her greatest collaborator. And Zoe, you are also welcome to ride through London on a horse naked in the spring of 2022, if you like. And finally, we are welcoming Chris Salisbury. Chris is an intercessor, a fire starter, and a not-so-secret agent for Gaia. Chris's love of nature has determined his professional life and his personal life. He has been a voice for the earth for the last 27 years as a trainer, educator, and outdoor instructor. Chris founded Wildwise, an outdoor education and training company, in 1999, after many years working as an education officer for Devon Wildlife Trust. With a professional background in the theatre, a qualification in drama therapy, and a career in environmental education, he uses every creative means at his disposal to encourage people to enjoy and value the natural world on courses he facilitates in the UK and abroad. And he has just released a new book called Wild Nights Out, The Magic of Exploring the Outdoors After Dark. And Chris, you are also invited to ride naked through London in the spring of 2022. So you can see where this is going as we rise up to reawaken together.
I have ridden horses naked, and it is a very awakening, enlivening experience. I'm not sure I'll do it in public.
Okay, well, you could train us. By us, I mean Tamsin. Okay, so our first question is for each of you to share a time when you have helped to reawaken something that has been suppressed or forgotten, and what has happened as a result. And so, Tamsin, you're sitting in the chair that I like to start with.
Yeah, this is it's kind of quite a beautiful question, isn't it? Of like where this intersects with like big social change reawakening that I have definitely been a part of. And then also these kind of more like intimate, personal things within me, which I've, like my life in some ways has been a journey of like reawakening the parts of me that are able to like enjoy themselves and like find beauty and rest, and prioritize community and prioritize care ahead of the, the kind of like those things that we are told to prioritize in this, you know, patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacist culture in which we find ourselves. Like, got to keep working, keep on going, keep on stressing, keep on laboring, keep on creating profit for other people. So yeah, I'm like, just to say, I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be talking about reawakening, because it feels like it's the task of my life, in many personal ways, to allow my truth, like my particular offering, to be awake, and to be boldly just mine, uniquely mine. And then, you know, I guess in terms of like particular moments, the best work that I've done as a like change maker has been when my desire to awaken something has been aligned with a kind of global awakening, a moment of awakening that like I didn't set the context for, I didn't make happen. It just has been, you know, it seems like it's happened from nowhere, those sorts of moments of awakening. So I guess like, you know, the moment last summer, after George Floyd's murder, when BLM just took over, like it put the subject of racism and anti-racism into our cultural and political consciousness in a way that no individual actor within those movements could have ever imagined happening, or could have ever predicted exactly when it would happen. And then for me and my involvement in movements, the moment in 2018, when after quite a long time of climate being suppressed or not spoken about because there were other important things to be talking about, like the global financial crash, et cetera, there was this moment when different stories seemed to align, and this kind of weaving of them created a huge and fierce fist that pushed climate and the ecological emergency into the mainstream. And, you know, we're living in the aftermath of that. And I guess, like, just to kind of talk a little bit about how it was to be an actor within that moment. Yeah, it was, so I guess it, like, you know, it is that thing where like different threads all kind of come together and they start, exactly like you were saying, they start to weave. And, you know, at the time when we, as people who were involved in this thing called Rising Up, which then became Extinction Rebellion, were like running around the country giving talks to like small groups, small community groups, the kind of low-hanging fruit of the environmental movement. So like Green Party meetings, Greenpeace meetings, church meetings. And we were going there with this offering that we would give you a talk. And the talk was called, let me remember, I mean, I gave it about 400 times, but it was called Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It. And this talk was like bringing the truth of where we are with climate change and just kind of smashing through the denial that all of us kind of have to live in, because the ferocity of that truth is really destabilizing. And, you know, in some ways now we will have to get better at being resilient to that truth and figuring out how we create our lives in, or how we live our lives in a context of climate emergency. So anyway, we're doing these talks, and the end point of these talks was, okay, we're going to tell you all about the terrifying science. We're going to tell you about social movements and how, like, what happens when social movements get together, and how much change can happen when people are prepared to do things that are pretty daring. So, like, definitely talking about nonviolent disobedience as the thing, like the answer, or an answer in a menu of answers, it turns out. And we were signing people up to get arrested on the 31st of October 2018, when we were going to go to Parliament Square and declare a rebellion against the British government. And so we'd do a talk to like 50 people or 25 people. And after we'd done the talk, about half of those people would say, like, yeah, I'm willing to come to Parliament on that morning, and I'm willing to get arrested. And we take down everyone's numbers. And, you know, we did, there were probably about 30 of us doing these talks all around the UK. It took a kind of summer of planning. When we were doing this, at the same time, Greta Thunberg was preparing herself to start her school strikes. And her school strike started kind of 7 weeks before the declaration of emergency that we did in October 2018. So that was kind of, she was going through her process and responding in her way. We were doing this over here in the UK. And then at the same time, the IPCC report came out and said that we've got 12 years left to turn the ship round. And I think people kind of remember that report because it was a moment of increasing consciousness around the climate and ecological emergency. And I guess it's like that thing of that there were these 3 unique things and also many other unique things that were happening. Like people were starting to turn again, the impacts of climate change were being felt fiercer. It was becoming more obvious. You couldn't keep ignoring it. But I guess it's that thing of when do those movements tick through so that denial isn't anymore an option? And, we've been a species in denial about the impact that we have on the planet. And I guess, that moment, it really did feel like that something was being awoken, that all of us were suddenly hugely aware of the climate and ecological emergency, and that, we were asking a more sophisticated question than just oh God, someone has to do something. It was oh God, okay, what do I do? How can I be a participant in defining whatever the future is going to be? And I think that's a really exciting awakening, is that I think increasingly people are figuring it out, and my answer isn't the same as anyone in this room's answer. But I think everyone is starting to ask that question now, and that feels like a vast awakening.
Thank you. You just reminded me actually of being at Parliament Square before the first Rebellion Day when Greta came to speak.
Yeah.
And I was standing with you and Greta's dad was there. And I was like, oh, she's really good. And I was sort of going to ask him, oh, could I get your number to have her on the podcast? And then didn't. And then a month later, she was like Greta Thunberg. And, so it is that thing of how you can just tap into a moment, and then the moment awakens through this
and escalates
power.
massively.
Yeah. Thank you. We'll come back to some of where the personal awakening and the kind of organizing awakening come together, because I think that's a really interesting aspect around this theme. But before that, I would love for us to hear from everyone. Zoe, can you share a moment for you where you reawakened something that was forgotten or stuck?
It's so inspiring to hear your story, Tamsin, and I've definitely been one of the low-lying fruits in small community organisations that have been turning up to these events and trying to do work from the inside. I suppose for me on that note, and a really sort of personal example, was about having studied climate change and climate denial and become very disillusioned about 15 years ago, being the only person of colour doing the course I was doing, having written papers on literally climate denial and front groups, and really realising that it was so set in back then. There was nothing that was really being acknowledged or done. I went into a period of quite despair, basically, of personal despair, and came back from my master's in ecology very drained and disempowered from the experience, but did also come back with a lot of rage and a lot of rage at the people who were teaching the course and who were telling us that to experience a connection with nature and a connection with climate, we had to get out into these wild landscapes and we had to have access to nature. So fast forward, that burnt away for a few years, and I ended up setting up a company called The Golden Company, which worked with inner city young people working with bees and beekeeping to facilitate connections with nature. And so it was a very, very small community-based project on a housing estate in Hackney. But it was one of those things that, like you've mentioned, Tamsin, and you've mentioned, Amisha, that it was just the moment that it happened, everything came together, and the idea got pushed up and kind of taken on by people we could never have imagined. So we had lots of people wanting to work with us and wanting to fund us and support the work with these young people in Hackney, and it started to sort of spiral out from there. And the beauty of that work in terms of awakening for me was that although we were using bees as our point of connection with nature, So we were getting young people living in Hackney who'd never seen the River Thames before. That's that's less than 2 miles from their doorstep. And they were turning up week after week and working with bees. And some of them were in gangs, some of them had been in not Borstal, what's it called, that Feltham. Some of them had come out to Feltham, so they were really tough young kids. And what I saw over a period of time was an awakening as the bees worked on the young people, and the young people opened up and allowed nature to work through them and with them, and they began to weave nature into their weekly lives. And so they stepped into the garden that we were working in, and we started to experience this sense of nature weaving through them. And then we took this project into some very corporate spaces. So we then ended up working with banks and corporate spaces where the young people were giving their power and their knowledge of nature to the corporates who were working in these banks, who then themselves, what was amazing to see was they themselves then went on to have an awakening facilitated by the young people. So there was a kind of inversion of power going on through the bees and through nature. It was just really interesting to witness and experience, and the idea really got a lot bigger than I could have expected, because it just sort of felt like it came at the right time. And for myself and for my own sense of awakening, it really healed the experience and the damage I'd experienced studying ecology and being the only person of colour in that space, and always having to feel like the one in the room to have to speak to issues of race and all those kind of things that come up for us all the time. It really began to heal that. So yeah, I guess the awakening was around allowing nature in and through us, and understanding and feeling that we don't have to go out into beautiful landscapes. I've had the privilege of being in a lot of beautiful landscapes through my work, but that we can find the beauty and the expansiveness and the depth of connection through being in very small urban areas. We can find a wildness and a power and a reconnection with our intuitive animal selves, being in very sort of small urban areas and situations. So I guess that was my initial thought in response to that question.
Thank you, Zoe. Chris, what about you?
Thank you for inviting me, first of all, to be here. And thanks for being here, those in the flesh and those somewhere else in virtual land. It's so interesting to hear you reflect on these things. Maybe I cut in from a slightly different angle, in a way, in my practice and in my profession. And I think I'm going to sing you a song, partly by way of response to the question, and partly to awaken something in me as I sing, and awaken something perhaps in you. It has been said that spirit will not enter the room until a song has been sung. And so in the sort of spirit of village building, I'll offer you this very old song that goes back to the 1400s, and hopefully is a little bit on theme. And this is my, attempt at a very old folk song. Awake, awake, sweet England, awake. Unto the land obediently, oh, let us all partake. For our future now is calling under the sky so clear. So awake, awake, sweet England, for our history's always near. Let us sing unto this living story let us sing. In a way, some of my personal awakening has come through the opening up a practice of singing to the land, singing with the people I invite over that threshold into wild nature, but not always, of course, and to tell stories of the land. That is a very personal kind of reawakening for me. And I'm pleased to report that when people indulge themselves and step over that threshold from indoors to outdoors, in whatever setting actually, and I've worked in virtually every setting I can think of, including those very urban settings, underneath a sky at least, there is a coming home of sorts. There is a awakening. There is a remembering of who we are, who we really are, in connection to the wild world, in connection to things like the provocations of songs and stories that help us remember, if you like, our kind of whole selves, and not this terribly industrial sort of left brain kind of dominant sort of culture that we find ourselves in. So, those are some of the flavors, I suppose, around my personal experience of reawakening. And I have to say that those who spend a little bit longer, I mean, it can only needs to be a day, a whole day, an overnight, or God forbid, 5 days coming out on camp. And the reawakening is deep. It is often a sort of whole pile of new trouble that in that remembering, there are big life changes and decisions made coming back from that, kind of altar of the natural world. So that's what I, am privileged to offer, is a space out in nature, mostly in Devon, but not always, to some wilder places to host people in the outdoors for that kind of immersive, experiential time.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the words, a whole lot of trouble in respect to the process of awakening, reawakening. I wonder if any of you can share something that is perhaps more of an example of reawakening an aspect of yourself, or reawakening into a more embodied sense of yourself, or a more soulful aspect of yourself, and a little bit about that process and what's unfolded or is unfolding.
I mean, I could just, since I'm here and you are looking at me, and this is the way we travel around this circle. Just for listeners, I'm sat opposite Amisha, and yes, we've been going. Tamsin speaks, and then Zoe, and then Chris, although it might change. But yeah, I really, when I came out of university, I'd really been having my left brain trained for my whole life, since childhood. And then, the kind of university spaces that I was in, it was such a celebration of productivity. And all of my self-worth was tied up with being a success. It didn't really matter where that success, what version of success it was, as long as it could be something that could be shown to others and somebody would be proud of it. Probably my father is the success that the model that I was going, kind of shocking, but also successful. I'm the youngest child. And so I came out of university, and I came out of university also into a kind of the first glimmerings for me of climate, of a politics or of a culture that was not taking climate seriously. So, I think it was Gordon Brown that was Prime Minister, and he was like, yeah, hey, let's go for the expansion of the third runway at Heathrow Airport. And so that was kind of just that was assumed. Why on earth wouldn't you expand Heathrow Airport? Why shouldn't we build a third runway? And I I think I first came at climate through the lens of fear. And like, I'm so tender about this at the moment, because like there is a lot of fear to be felt when we think about, you know, the future that is emerging and the future that is being allowed to emerge by those like with the most power to transform the system. And of course, like, it's not in their interests to transform it, but you would think that at this late stage, with so much at risk, there might be some leadership from the top.
And they are also humans with life on this planet.
Yeah.
And children and grandchildren.
Yeah, exactly. It's really, I mean, it's troubling, isn't it? And I guess there are just different levels at which, like, some people are not going to have to feel the impacts, and they can believe that their privilege will maintain forever. Like, it's been that way forever, it will be that way forever. And I think they don't need to feel like the systems changing, the climate changing is going to shake their privilege, although, like, of course it will. And we're seeing that already in some ways. But I think, like, I only very recently kind of attached or became able, like, found the courage to speak about my queerness in terms of, like, the climate emergency. And, you know, at university, I was kind of obsessed with moments in history when external contexts had been manipulated by people in power to create conditions where people were othered, where people were, you know, where people who were different were seen as the problem and were scapegoated and were attacked and were et cetera. And I guess, like, in some ways I live with a kind of apocalyptic framework in my imagination all of the time. I don't want it. Like, I want a capacious, like, beautiful, rich, enriching imagination. But, like, for some reason, I'm kind of stumped with one that's like, we are going off the edge of cliff and apocalypse is where we're headed. And I think, like, for me, there is, like, it's actually quite personal. Like, there is a fear of, you know, being different. Like, I am different or, like, different from the status quo, like, whatever this is. Like, I'm, you know, like, we're all different from the status quo. But, like, I think I've responded from fear, like, from a fear of like, what's going to be taken away, like, how much there is to lose. What will humanity become? And that it can activate you massively. Like, the power of fear to get you, like, running and organizing incredibly quickly is intense, but it is such an unhealthy foundation for action. And so for my entire 20s, I ran everywhere. And at the same time, I had in me this kind of, like, you know, this like personal trainer of, like, where are your outcomes? What are your successes? So I was, like, running, like, gotta stop the climate emergency, gotta stop the climate. And also, I've got to be really successful at stopping the climate emergency. It's just, like, such a toxic mix of motivation. And, like, lo and behold, I burnt out phenomenally. And I really crashed. I guess, like, you were talking about this as well, Zoe, of, like, I just crashed into despair. Like, that, you know, it was like people were much more, like, it wasn't so much like that people were talking about climate and ecological emergency. Like, it was, you know, it was like a big wall of public and political disinterest that I just kept throwing myself at, and then kind of dripping down, and then throwing myself at a different lever, dripping down. And I guess...
and big levers, like when you ran for Parliament as an independent.
Yeah, like, you know, I was like, oh, I mean, I was pretty effective because I wanted to be, you know, celebrated for being a very successful political change or whatever. I guess, yeah, like, I'm so glad that I burnt out. I think there are some things that you can only really realize when you're, like, pretty helpless, and where you've really surrendered to the fact that actually, like, no one person can sort this out. Like, it's not on any one of us. And that kind of recognition that, you know, a kind of acceptance, I guess, and people talk about this within the kind of grief curve of dealing with the climate emergency. It's like, you know, the end goal is the end of the grief curve, like after denial, after this and after that, is that you accept that we are here, this is the context, and then you can start figuring out, like, from a different basis, from a kind of foundation of like self-care, self-love, like community, trying to work alongside people rather than like be the person at the front. You can start to build some more sophisticated environmental practices, or I have started to build some more sophisticated kind of environmental campaigns, political practices. And I think those have been embedded since I kind of came back onto the scene, which is like the beginning of Extinction Rebellion really was part of me coming back onto the scene. I think they have been embedded in like what I've brought. And, you know, like activism is so filled with people being motivated by fear, working furiously, and then burning out. And I think what I have brought is like, let's, you know, what we build together is actually more important than like the outcome of our goal. You know, if we're like able to actually talk to each other, bring our fears to the table, not speak over each other, not hear you because actually what I've got to say is more important and I feel challenged by your very existence, you know, like all of that, like kind of, that's like the three things that I always say is like patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism is like the things to kind of dismantle from our ways of relating to each other and to ourselves and to the natural world. Like if we can start to do that, and very imperfectly because we're all products of this world, then I think we can, have a more like a richer environmental practice or a richer kind of community of people responding to this stuff. And I definitely, like for me, that was like, I don't think I act from fear anymore. I think I act from like love in some ways. Like I want to bring love and I want to be loved and I want to like be part of communities where love is the energy behind what we're doing. Something like that.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share? It doesn't have to be in the same order. We can disrupt all patterns.
Would you mind repeating the question, and I'll refresh my response.
The question's not that important as what's kind of alive in you right now. But the question is around what something from your own personal experience of reawakening. You know, and I invite it to be a discussion, you know, so you can say what's relevant for you, what's coming up, rather than what I'm asking.
Well, one of my responses to that, from a personal response, is something of the more mythic dimension, I suppose. And I've been provoked and challenged, really, to open up a dialogue, in the broadest sense of the word, with the more than human world. And it's just brought a remarkable amount of sort of riches and treasure and resource to me. So, notwithstanding the incredible and awesome, you know, political kind of activism that's going on various front lines, which I know both of you are involved with, this is a more personal kind of agency that has come about through opening up a very non-kind of rational dialogue or interaction with the natural world. And I'm really speaking about swimming in sort of imaginal kind of realms, with what would some people would describe as the sort of more real world, as opposed to the one that is sort of available to all of our sort of tangible senses and that we experience in the everyday. And that is a slightly odd thing to speak about in a way. but I can't tell you how much.
Why do you think that's an odd thing to speak about?
Because it isn't normal.
Who says what's normal?
These terms. Well, I'm just talking about a dominant kind of, conversation that is more concerned with, what you might describe as the everyday world. So I'm sort of introducing here the kind of aspects of the soul, really, awakening, which is very different from the normal kind of ego path of development, which is very necessary to sort of survive in the world. But there comes a point in a life where there's something more, and the dimension that I've discovered is available happens to be a very resourcing one to send me back onto my own front line. That gives me agency in my activism in the way that I choose, to put myself out there to affect change in the world and be one of those hopefully change makers. And that is, it's a very personal journey. And I suppose I've come to have a conviction around that personal work in order to affect one's sort of more public or political kind of drive, and in order to affect sort of the deeper change, I suppose I've subscribed to a view that, actually one has to attend to the agency of one's being self, one's soul kind of movements, to bring that into some coherence for oneself. And I've just had, that experience over the last sort of 9 or 10 years particularly, which has given me, I guess, insights into actually what I have to contribute to the world. My unique place, my very own and individual kind of role within this, very complex matrix of everybody doing these different things. But I have to say that has only been able to be possible for me when I step over that very purposefully, a particular threshold, and invite a kind of more soulful conversation with a world that is not a human world. So I'm advocating taking a break from the human world and the sort of the confusion and the strife of that, and whatever it looks like, and it can be a park, in a city or a garden. It's where you're sort of stepping off a certain sort of train, and just going out to sit, perhaps, and just change the rhythm and allow yourself to get very, very present and feel whatever you need to feel, but also consider a wild possibility that this other human, more than human dimension has an intelligence, has something to say to you, has a hunger to know you. And so various practices I've begun to step out, and it looks like a man talking to himself, of course, but to go and speak out loud to those forces and just gather myself in that process. And I'm following one particular inspiration of mine, who's become, he and his partner, this is Bill Plotkin and Janine Mary Haugen, who have offered a sort of pathway for me, a framework for me to become, that's right, a much, much more effective agent of change, simply by getting off the trail, I suppose, and doing. So this is my, response to this sort of personal kind of work that feeds back into the political. So I think that makes sense. Probably not.
Chris, it all makes sense, and I feel like we need to be able to talk about this with full, of course there's more than human in this world, and of course we all need to be out there talking to trees, not just fighting for them, and that's this turning, that's something that feels like it needs to be reawoken in all of us, because there must have been a time in myth or in real, whatever that means, where every human talked to the more than human world. Zoe, what's alive for you?
I feel relieved that the conversation's turned this way and we've arrived here, because I feel like this really gets to the heart of what we're really struggling with in terms of dismantling the patriarchy and really acknowledging that there are multiple knowledge systems and ways of understanding the world, and and consciousnesses. And I suppose in my own experience, to keep it personal, again, it's been with the journey of the bees and weaving through my life for the last 12 years a practice of keeping bees, which started in a very capitalist way. I ordered my bees in the post. They came in boxes. I mean, to think back on it now, it makes me, I can't believe it. You know, I ordered my bees, they came in plastic boxes, 6 plastic boxes. When they got to the depot in Mount Pleasant in London, it said live bees do not cover. The people in the depot obviously freaked out, so they put them in plastic bags. So I went to pick up the bees at the beginning of this project, which I'd been funded, and they had sweated. There was water dripping.
Yes.
And if that's not a metaphor for this whole system, then I don't know what is. So the project started, the whole project started by me opening up boxes of dead bees.
Wow.
Thousands of dead bees. And it was there from the beginning, that was it. And that was the metaphor that stayed with me. You know, what am I doing? Why am I operating in this way? What's driving my work with these animals and where is the consciousness of the hive in this? What do the bees want? And over the last 12 years, for me, it's been about a return to, or a discovering and an opening to, allowing again the bees to work on me and actually to not be in control of the bees, to not extract from the bees. I don't take honey anymore. I take, if I'm lucky, a little bit of propolis off the edge of the hive and I use it for medicine, for making medicines. I don't drive the bees and force them and push them to generate lots of honey. And they've come into my dream world. And they come into my dream world all the time, and I feel very comfortable talking about it because I feel like it's really the essence of for me, it's really the essence of my practice actually. And even when I was in London actually after that disaster, I was very worried a lot of the time in London about the bees swarming, because obviously if you're in a housing estate in inner city London, the last thing you want is 600,000 bees flying through the housing estate. And although we managed them as well as we could, there was always a risk that could happen. So I started to meditate and practice with the bees. And it's hard to believe, but by the time we were leaving, after a couple of years, I would dream before the bees swarmed. So I would dream the night before, and I would say to my people that we need to get down to the hives tomorrow, the bees are going to swarm. And it happened twice. It happened twice that we were there waiting for them to swarm and the bees swarmed. They tell us if we're willing to listen, and I do really, really believe this, and I believe this, across the non-human world. I just think this listening to the non-human world and having the humility to connect and have the practice that allows us to really deeply listen and deeply allow our egos to dissolve. And I've struggled with especially my artistic ego, wanting to prove myself, and be recognised. But actually, when I sat back and allowed nature and allowed the bees particularly to speak with me, they've taught me a whole new way of being in the world, and they've really made me reassess, what's important in day-to-day life. And so, I guess that's the kind of example that really springs to mind.
Wow, Zoe, that's such powerful imagery that we're all holding of the dreams and the swarms.
And you've even got the sound of bees in your name. Zoe.
But I should also just add that I don't think this is not because I'm exceptionally connected, or that I think this is available to all of us. This is the crucial thing, and I think that's the message that we really, really need to be working on now. This is all of our birthright, and it's just about tuning in and tuning out all the noise that's going on everywhere else in the world. So yeah, I
wrote a book about intuition last year, and it really feels like we just have to understand it as an aspect of our intelligence, and actually how wasteful it is and has been, that we're not using half of our brains. Like that's the reality of it. And so what would happen, what's possible if we all reawaken that part of our intelligence? Like, we have no idea what humans can do if we all use that part of ourselves, and if that becomes normal. and it becomes part of just how we live in the world. And it feels like a really incredible time, because there is an opening that's happening for that to kind of move into a more accepted, open discussion. And I feel like the more that people share their experiences, the more it reawakens the possibility inside those that hear them. For me, a lot of the quote unquote training, like around intuition or the more mystical realms, has been because I've watched someone else who's in tune with their psychic awareness, and I've watched what they've done, and then I've worked out how I can apply it in my own moments when it arises, and then you just kind of learn these things, and then something else opens up in the field, and then you might go and talk to a tree that might teach you something else, and it's like this whole kind of unfolding of education that's a completely different to what we were given as education.
Yeah, this dominant culture idea, isn't it? It's really like, even when you said like dissolve your ego, I was like, oh my god, like what bliss if I could just dissolve my ego. But it's such a challenge, isn't it? It's like, you know, this kind of like the myth of like the individual kind of idea, like this culture, it's like dominant culture of like, that's where we're headed. Like each of us is this kind of atomized individual lives that is like fiercely going after their particular like desire or like their heart's something, and that being separate and probably in competition with like everyone around them, and that you've got to kind of like fiercely defend this rather than a kind of, you know, like I just think when both of you have spoken about, like, and in fact all three of you have spoken about, you know, like that when you go out into nature, or when you let like a small amount of nature kind of drench over you, that like you can't help but have your ego be dissolved. You know, it's like no wonder they're like concreting up everything and making like it harder and harder to access nature, because actually like, the experience of going out into nature is a transformative experience. And I think like, yeah, you know, I used to roll my eyes at like self-care talk. I used to be so disdainful of people that were like, I like to go out into nature. I was like, whatever, like we've got a fight to fight here. Like, stop like spending hours in nature and like come back to the table and figure out how we're going to shut down that airport or whatever. Like, and now it's like, no, like this, you know, if we actually want to transform our culture, we have to transform our culture. We have to start from, you know, like really like uproot it. And I think, yeah, like some of this is, yeah, it's you know, it's so tricky, because even like the language around our dominant culture is kind of like, you know, you're not, like very, I think we are getting more sophisticated, and the events of like the last couple of years in particular has like allowed us to see that actually like, you know, there are systems in place, and we need to talk about and interrogate those systems so that we can better uproot them. But that's so new, and like some people, you know, like the whole like woke thing of people just being like, if you're going to talk about racism, we're going to call you woke. If you're going to talk about gender, we're going to call you woke. If you're going to talk about, and you're just like, yeah, like I think there's, you know, we just need to like push back at this so much and be like, you know what, we can sit here and talk about hugging trees, and that would be like an incredibly valuable discussion for us to have, especially if it inspired some other people to like boldly go out into their like green spaces and like have a conversation with a tree or talk, you know, like, oh, I just love the embrace of a tree. But it's like, there is part of us, right? It's like, don't talk about that, like roll your eyes at that, because like if you talk about that, then you're going to be one of those people, and if you're one of those people, then they won't take you seriously, and you've got to be taken seriously to have any credibility, and actually the rules of the game are the rules you should follow. And it's like, no, I want to like tear the rules up and like assert that there are other ways of living that are like so valuable. And I think that is happening. You know, it's clearly happening because we're having this conversation now.
Yeah, it's always interesting to look into where did the rules come from as well. And so 2021, I am not a dog person, but recently welcomed a puppy into my life. And so I started looking into dog training because that's what you're supposed to do. And then I was just like, wow, I'm not that comfortable with this sort of dominating, being the leader of the pack and all of this kind of thing. And I started to research it a bit. And then I found that what's known as modern dog training comes from the 50s. It's training dogs to be soldiers. So the dog heels to your left because the rifle's on your right. And then I was like, well, I don't need a soldier dog in my life right now. And so actually, I don't need to follow all those rules. And instead, I could do this as a practice of being in relationship with a wild being and working out intuitively how we can live together. And that's, that's like a whole different way of approaching something that's so normal in our culture of where can you take out the dominance and bring in relationship?
Well, actually, taking a leaf out of your book with the bees, Zoe, when we look into the kind of models in the natural world for wisdom, for inspiration, there are so many that can speak, very eloquently to us. And you bring in the dog, which of course by any other name is a wolf, and behaves just like a wolf. There is indeed a whole other paradigm of how you should approach and could approach, owning a dog as or welcoming a dog as part of your human wolf pack, and treat the whole thing very, very differently from that paradigm, which recognizes kind of alpha male, kind of leadership, which it's pretty well been dissed in wolf conservation now. And I've met the fellow who went to live with a wolf pack for 2.5 years in the wilderness and was accepted by the pack. It's a long story, but it's an extraordinary tale. But he came back with a very, very different view of how, wolves and therefore dogs operate, and just leaning in to that understanding, paying attention, listening, because it's speaking to us all of the time. And we can find out so much and be so informed to just have another way that'll lift us hopefully out of this sort of wretched sort of, sort of lifestyle that we've ended up in at the moment. So, again, it's another encouragement just to lean into that sort of wisdom of the wild. But I would also qualify this, actually, just in case you're going to be set up for a bit of disappointment. It's not a shopping mall, the natural world. It's not like you put it down on a to-do list. Oh, yes, I'm going to go and get taught by a tree. I've got about, 3/4 of an hour, on Wednesday afternoon to do that. It's not like this just sort of oracle you can just sort of go and just get things from. It needs a different mindset. It needs some slowing down. It needs you, and this is the very first and important part, setting an intention and be willing to suspend, if you like, that side of your brain to pay a quality of attention, that isn't, the everyday attention, actually, and be willing to listen in a way that, it is a deeper listening. And yes, things will happen. That's what the trouble is, really. There are. And hopefully it's the right kind of trouble rather than the wrong kind. But things will happen.
It's the trouble.
These are powerful forces, and most, if not all, cultures apart from the one that we find ourselves in, understood that there were intermediaries. That there were different words for it, the invisibles. There was this other realm, the imaginal realm, that was available. Some people would talk in terms of the ancestors to sort of lean into, those who've lived before and know an awful lot about life and death, and what it is to, struggle through life in this domain. And they could lean in and just glean things, that would help us on our way a little bit to live more lightly or more sustainably or more beautifully or more with grace and humility. Where are we going with this conversation?
Thank you, Chris. Can you tell us who the Wolfman's name is?
He's called Sean Ellis, and he works with his wonderful wife Kim Ellis down in Cornwall. And you can go and visit them. He does a lot of work with dog training to just adjust things. You've got to know what social role your dog is. And you've got to know what social role you are. You've got to understand this sort of pack system so that everyone can sort of slot in comfortably. Most of the problems are, as he sees through the dog owners that he sees, of people trying to make the dog, fulfill a role that they shouldn't naturally fill, or that you're not fulfilling that role and therefore the dog is having to. Very interesting work. And he wrote a book called Wolf Within, which is this impossible story of 2.5 years, literally living with the wolf pack, literally eating what the wolf pack brought him until he was accepted, fully accepted. It took about 3 months apparently, lots of nips and bites and things. And he became the nanny of the pups. That was his social role. But it's such a beautiful kind of model. The wolves are so beautifully positioned between the being wild things, but also being very family, having these family structures in this integrated system, which is so beautifully designed when you sort of start to read more and more and more about it. But you could apply that to bees. You could apply that to, wild horses. There are many of those communities out in the natural world to take inspiration from. And beyond that, of course, the genius designers are also now, with their biomimicry, leaning into those models to see these incredible designs that nature's come up with over, a few billion years to help us also address, the issues of the day in terms of, really good solutions.
Thank you. Well, I would love for us to come into this space and see if there's any questions from anyone here. Just before we do that, just to kind of tie up where we're at, is there anything that's really still alive for anyone here around what really needs reawakening and what radical reawakening for our future might look like? Just a little one to sum up where we've been before we get taken somewhere else. Zoe.
I had a few thoughts on this. Again, it's tending the inner. I ended up tending the inner garden and really carving out space for rest, and that not being an indulgent thing, that being the norm, because it pushes back against everything that capitalism stands for, and it's so clear, but it's so difficult to do and achieve. So I just think it's that simplicity of rest. Rest.
It's the nothing of my slip up in the intro. The Invisibles.
Just to add to that, my very clever wife was doing a dissertation at Schumacher College when I met her, and her dissertation was on the agency of being as an agency, as opposed to this to-do list and the agency of doing, which is all very valuable. But what she sort of was tuning into was this business of attending to one's being as a profoundly, radical act, actually. And I absolutely loved that. And that's what.
And then you married her.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tamsin, what would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I think I'm really shimmering from Zoe's call to rest. And what can I add to that? I guess I think that the reason why I find rest so hard is because when I rest, I find myself. And for various reasons, I actually find myself, it takes a lot for me to love myself. Because, this system tells us that we are unlovable unless we've got that, or that there's something wrong with us that needs to be filled with this, or that we're not good enough just by being ourselves. And then there are some particular intersections that I inhabit which are erased or oppressed. So I guess there's something about when I rest, I'm there,
And what I want to do is just like, oh, love that person so much. And I'm getting much better at it. And I do think that, like, if we were all able to be with ourselves and like give ourselves an enormous loving embrace, then we'd be able to encounter each other without needing you to like tell me that I'm okay, or needing you to, needing anything from me really. So maybe it's something about that, like rest and self-care and love. And I think, there are like, these are the things that have been like pushed out, and like intelligence like this exists within queer communities, it exists within like Black communities, it exists in like many different communities. It doesn't really exist in our dominant cultural community. And so I guess like for all of us, like there's so much intelligence if we turn outwards to get it. There are calls for us to be awakened, like these people, these experiences, like the Black imagination, like the queer families, the idea of chosen family, of building community, like all of these things, like they're calling us to be awake to other possibilities, other dynamics by which we can, the non-human world.
Is like one that I tend to feel like a little bit like I don't give it as much attention as these two, but like I know that there's intelligence there that's just going like, wake up, wake up, wake up. So yeah, just kind of tuning into that is really great.
And it starts with, my piece would be around stopping. As you say, resting. My students have a practice of, we call it the sit spot, which is to just spend some time regularly in the same place, under a tree, garden, wherever you can get to easily, and cultivate that agency of being. There's a restful place there, a resourcing place, and a listening place for these things that come up. And one of the practices as well, inside of that, to take away from this would be a gratitude practice, to remember, despite all of this, confusion and strife, is the blessings. And it is said that gratitude tempers greed. In other words, it's a state of sufficiency. And there is such resource in that. Actually, when you spend a few minutes remembering what you're grateful for, and these are all sometimes obvious things, but in just saying them out loud to someone else even, just changes the state that you're in and provides more agency and more resource. So that's another little something that can happen in the restful period, in the little sit spot practice, in the moments of pausing, the moments of just self-care that embodies that sort of a practice. These are radical and revolutionary acts. They're very, very kind of not in the kind of, regular sort of day world stream of existence, are they? But, it's all the rage, mindfulness. So this is just another sort of expression of that need that we are now finally recognizing. That we do, we are tender beings, and that we need to attend to ourselves as well in order to tend to others.
I promised we would have a question. Who has the question? Dion, can you come here, because my mic's going to fall down my trousers if I come to you. And can I ask you to keep your question really succinct, because we don't have a huge amount of time.
We could keep our answers succinct as well.
One word answers.
Not all on you.
Hi everybody, thank you. My name's Dion Ellis-Taylor. So I'm just thinking, Tamsin, about what you were talking about regarding tree hugging, because I think it's a really important point. How important is it that we are not only speaking with ourselves? How important is, and how useful is, a truly inclusive and accessible language? And what should that language sound and look like? For example, hugging trees, eating the food from dogs, dreaming and talking to bees. How harmful might an inaccessible language be? What kind of harm occurs regarding our greater cause?
Thank you, Dion.
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer for this because I think there are enormous sets of interests that other the sort of language that we use. So in fact, Boris is like prime example of this, of trustees, tree hugging, whatever's kind of the frog kind of belittling of the biggest, most important issues of our time. People who are responding to those are suddenly all bracketed together in like a kind of like white middle class, lofty, which actually it doesn't necessarily reflect the movement, or at least what's like now emerging as the movement, or the movements. So yeah, I think like authenticity is everything. I think you can talk about tree hugging and you can talk about these and you can talk about all of these things as long as you're talking about them like with your most authentic, like I think so. Do you have anything to react?
I do apologise for the question, but I think it's important.
Yeah, it's super important. It's really important. I think we can all be conscious of it as well, and we can try and have conversations that go beyond, you know, like there are many ways to talk about things that we're talking about, and like luckily I think it is now like we and I say that as a kind of white person within the environmental movement are learning so much from like indigenous cultures, black feminist wisdom, like, you know, like just the vastness of it, people who have relationships with the planet who aren't white, like, and suddenly you're like, oh right, okay, like there are other ways of talking about this that make sense to like some, you know, like to a single mum in like a council estate in Newham.
I think we're approaching a 10th tipping point. That tipping point being a social one, where it isn't white middle class issue.
Yeah.
I meet people down and dirty on the street, but they talk to me, I have conversation. They really care.
Yeah.
They want to do something.
Exactly.
They want to feel included and involved.
Very good. Can I just add something briefly?
Just to summarise, because what Dion just shared might not have been heard on the mics and by those not in the space, but just that, that there's people out there that are doing this and living this, and that's important to acknowledge.
I just love the question. I love the sort of provocation and challenge within it. My very brief kind of response to it will be that comes from a wise rabbi who once said that the shortest distance between one human being and another human being is a story. And I tell a lot of stories, and it is one of those, you know, vehicles to use. Know that, you know, traditional narratives, you know, particularly potent, but can be biographical narratives too. To tell a story is what can build bridges, you know, between cultures and people, and I've seen it the world over in my long apprenticeship as a storyteller. So that would just be a small response to that great question.
Zoe.
Just to second that great question, and really to second what Chris has just said, I was just mindful of Charles Eisenstein, who in his sort of speaking in visions of the future talks about us becoming conscious storytellers, and just reminding us of the importance and the invoking power of the word. And so really to distill our use of language down, which, and unfortunately now what we see from Boris in many ways the polar opposite, of course, of that, but just the power of the word, the power of invoking stories that can work across time and space.
And we just shouldn't underestimate, you know, that word, that spoken word, the power of the word. They're like spells. They understood it in the old days, and the sort of bardic sentimentality and sentience was that, you know, this speaking was like spell casting. You know it as a storyteller. It's the abracadabra, the evra achadabra, the old Aramaic expression, which is where that comes from. As I speak, so I create. It's powerful stuff. And so, you know, being kind of conscious about the language you use, being conscious about the invitations you're making and the images that you're painting is part of this, absolutely. Could go on about that.
Them and us. I think that would sum up.
Dion just added, we can't afford a them and us. And I feel moved to remind us, like as Chris said, when you connect to trees and the sky and the earth, it kind of grounds the power that you have. And like Zoe said, like we all have access to this power. It's part of who we are as humans. And as Tamsin said, it activates us more to be more useful in that way of actually being political for the earth. And for me, there's a story that I've shared around discovering the art of tree whispering, and then sharing the tree whispers publicly was another big kind of initiation. But that every time I go and ask these trees for a whisper for the community that I'm sharing it with, the futures community, it's always an activation. It's always like the words are like rhythmic, and they kind of ground into that sense of being and possibility in a way that I know I wouldn't just say down the microphone without being in that dynamic relationship. And I feel that one of the things we're being asked to reawaken at this time is the complete normalness of this activity. And Boris can tease people for being a tree hug. I don't aspire to be like Boris. And there's not one aspect that I've seen modelled in Boris in the last 15 years that I've aspired to be like. I'm very confused as to how he has managed to keep getting rehired into big jobs. Because I feel that for me, as a brown woman that comes from an immigrant family, if I had done just 5% of one of the things that he's done, I would for sure never work again. But here we are. Just don't know where that came from. It came from the Invisibles into this space. And so to close our conversation, we have a few moments each, few minutes each, to share how can we rise up to reawaken. And I ask you to share your call to action, your call to being, your call to rest, whatever it is. And then also to share how we can connect with you deeper, your websites or socials, whatever the ways that you want to be connected through. Chris.
I'm bound as a storyteller to lean into a bit of old story for this. There's a kind of very old myth from within the sort of culture of Western Europe, or the more recent culture, stretching back a few hundred years, the myth of Parsifal. I don't know if everyone is familiar with the myth of Parsifal, but Parsifal is a young and sort of heroic young knight in Arthur's court. He's charged, along with the other knights, to find this Holy Grail, this mysterious, elusive chalice. And there's no sort of A to B route to get there. But he finds himself, after a massive wandering and many adventures, in this very bleak wasteland, and ends up at this castle, ends up at this very morbid and somber feast, where there's this image in the corner, this character of the wounded sovereign. And he meets the sovereign, doesn't say anything, because detail in the story, which takes about 4 hours to tell, by the way, so I'm giving you a real, précis here. The detail in part of that narrative is that he was told by his mother, who he was brought up by as a single mother, he was brought up never to ask a question of those in authority, which is an intriguing little detail. So he doesn't say anything. Now, short story is that he gets back and he's exposed by this very wise woman back in Arthur's court, who publicly humiliates him, saying, "You idiot, you were there, you didn't ask a question, you failed to ask a question." And that's a very challenging part of the story, to ask the listeners, what question have you failed to ask so far? That'd be something to take away and reflect on. But Parsifal eventually, knows that redemption means going back to that castle, but of course he can't find it. It takes years and years and years But eventually he does, and he turns up very world weary, and he's lived a life by now, and he's made all his mistakes. But then he sees the same scene. There's the wounded king, and he goes straight up to the wounded king and he says, what ails thee? That's 3 words that I think are really potent for our times. He follows it up by saying, how can I be of service? So he shifts the emphasis basically from himself, all of that orientation around serving his own needs, and places his attention on how can I be of service to you, or in this case, the wider world. And that is finding your own path of particular service, which may not be hanging banners from Parliament Square. It may be, hosting a kind of mindfulness, little circle in your community. I mean, it could be 1,000 different things, but it's tuning into in what way can you be of service that will actually resolve your whole kind of life, really, when you sort of, get into alignment with what is it that I have to offer? What's my little piece there, and how can I attend to what is ailing, at the moment.
Thank you, Chris. And your website is wildwise.org?
Yes, it is, wildwise.co.uk for those invitations to the wild world.
Excellent. Tamsin, how can we rise up to reawaken?
I just think that we could all talk to some people. That's kind of where I'm at with it. I'm like, I don't really care what form your community activism or engagement or whatever takes. Like, I have found that the myth of individual excellence doesn't bring happiness, and that what has enriched my life enormously is belonging to communities and having a leadership role in some, much less a more humble, of servicey or different kind of service role in others. Just showing I loved it. It's a very small story from the pandemic. It's I wasn't involved at all in organising the mutual aid groups that happened where I lived, but I was able to just show up and be part of them, and it just felt so wonderful to show up. So I guess I will always be trying to persuade you to join the Green Party or persuade you to do this or to do that, but it doesn't really matter. I just think there's such enormous gifts in relationships that we can build. So just
And how can we contact you?
Oh, well, first of all, can everyone buy my book? It's called Do Earth, Healing Strategies for Humankind. And I just think it's the best single thing that I've ever produced, to be honest. And and it's not my wisdom at all. It's a collection of the lessons that I've learned from 15 years of doing this work, and some of that has been I have transformed through the work that I've done and the relationships that I've built and the lessons of people who have wisdom that is much more ancient and much more useful than what I was ever taught. So there's that, and then usually the thing that I'm most responsive to is Instagram, where I'm Tamsin Omond. So if you want to get in touch, then that's the way to do it.
Thank you. Zoe?
My publisher will be so happy.
It's about this refusal that we've had to fully perceive other organisms. So this is the human world and the non-human world and the more than human world. So this is about cultivating an ability to fully see what is present and what is there and with us, and that's people as much as rocks and trees and herbs and propolis and bees and those things. So I suppose that's really my call. I'm hopeless on social media, but I'm at Zoe L. Palmer, and my website's www.zoepalmer.com. Okay.
Thank you so much. Such a joy to be with you all. And in my answer to the question, how do we rise up to reawaken, I'll mention my book, which has 53 practices in it of how you can connect deeper to your intuition. And it's called Intuition. Intuition in French, and yeah, so it's been a real joy to be here for this panel and this conversation and all of the Rise Up conversations here over Change Festival. And so just want to also say a big thank you to Becky Birchall and the team at Change Festival, the whole village of Chettle, for coming to Change Festival and being behind the scenes, and everyone else that's been here in person, and how wonderful it is to be in person and to be able to connect this way. And I really hope that this call to rise up has been reignited in you. And I also realised that I think it's illegal in the UK to criticise politicians now, so I hope I don't get into trouble. But let's rise up. Thank you.
Yeah.